What are the main requests of the Arab Spring countries to the EU?
It is not easy to generalize, but obviously most of the countries where you had revolutionary events have a double challenge. On the one hand, organize the transition. So there's an element of capacity building, of democracy building, organizing free and fair elections, and rooting deep democracy in the country, including, for example, support to civil society. But then there's the other element, which is equally important, which is support to address the socio-economic challenges in the country. Most of the countries have a very high level of unemployment, especially youth unemployment. Most of the countries have a problem of a job market that is not fit to take in all the young people that are leaving school, for example. Then most of the countries are in very serious budgetary problems because the revolutionary events usually led to some sort of destabilizing of the macroeconomic situation. So there are budgetary constraints, there are constraints concerning the services that need to be delivered to the society, and therefore I would say most of the Arab Spring countries both need a lot of finance from international partners, but also a lot of technical support on the side of democratic transformation and democracy building.
How is the EU promoting the role of the civil society and the freedom of expression in the southern neighborhood countries? And where do you find more challenges?
Well, this is certainly one of the central elements in our new response in the new revamped European neighborhood policy. If anything, what distinguishes the period before the Arab Spring and now in or after the Arab Spring, it is that we have a very vibrant civil society in most of the countries, for example, even in Libya. So what we need to do is, I think, both support this emerging civil society, but also develop them as a partner for dialogue. And therefore, we are doing both. For example, on the side of policy dialogue, when we do our programming today, when we are working on the single support frameworks, our programming documents for the next phase, this will no longer be done just in dialogue with the government, with the authorities, with the ministers. But we'll have a structured dialogue also with civil society organizations in the country on the choice of sectors and also on financial allocations. But then at the same time, we also need to support civil society. We need to help civil society to be professional, for example, in holding governments to account, looking into policies, scrutinizing the way how the budget is implemented. So playing the role that a civil society plays also in Europe. And for that it needs to be strengthened through advice, through finance. We have specific financial means. We have set up since the Arab Spring a special civil society facility, which is worth about 34 million euros for 2 or 3 years together. And this is going to continue in the future. We have, as one of the responses to the Arab Spring, contributed to the creation of the European Endowment for Democracy, which outside the European Commission is much more flexible in its approach and will be able to support also civil society organizations that are not yet formally registered, that are not yet formally recognized, and therefore really grassroots. And we also have, of course, a very important instrument in the Anna Lindh Foundation, which is more geared to work in the area of culture and similar sectors. But there again, you have a very important civil society element. And civil society will also benefit from the activities that we are financing through the Anna Lindh Foundation based in Alexandria. So it's, I think, a mixture between making more finance available through all kinds of projects, including specific regional programs, and then also real dialogue. And I can say that every time Cathy Ashton or Stefan Füle travels to one of the countries, they have meetings with a very representative choice of civil society representatives, and that is something we didn't have in the past.
Do you promote actions focused on women's rights in the southern neighborhood countries? And could you please make concrete examples if you do this?
Women's rights, I think, in various forms. Of course, women's rights are a matter of mainstreaming. So in reality, you should, in every program, have a specific focus on empowering women, for example, when it comes to job creation and so forth. But there are certainly also specific facilities and specific funds under regional cooperation and also bilateral cooperation that are geared to women's organizations that help women to take part in the activities of civil society and also in democracy-building activities. For example, supporting women candidates in elections. For example, encouraging women to take part in elections as voters. But there are lots of specific programs as well. For example, programs that help women to set up their own businesses, small-scale entrepreneur programs with a volley, with a specific subsector for women. I think this has very much increased, and we are pressing very hard our partner governments to foresee specific action for women in their priority planning for the next period.
Is there any country in particular that you want to mention for a success story or a positive experience on the gender issues?
I wouldn't really do so. I mean, on the one, you have a specific dichotomy. On the one hand, you have a more vibrant civil society, including women's organizations in many countries. On the other hand, in some of those countries, even those countries that go through formal democratization processes, the kind of margin of maneuver for civil society gets more narrow and more restricted. Egypt is a recent example. So I would say where you have already a consolidated civil society, or where you have a long tradition of certain organizations, like in Tunisia, like in Morocco, chances are certainly easier, and chances are, let's say, better and more easy to grasp for women civil society organizations. But you see women taking a more active interest in policy making a little bit everywhere in the region, also in Libya, so also in countries where you don't have such an enrooted tradition yet.
And how is the EU boosting the development of trade and small business in the countries of the Arab Spring?
That is certainly a central element. First, I think the entire cooperation that we had with this region ever since the early 90s was very much about trade facilitation, about boosting trade exchanges, bringing in foreign direct investment. And this, of course, takes an even more important dimension now as we are starting to negotiate deep and comprehensive free trade agreements with Morocco, with Tunisia, hopefully, other countries that take an interest like Jordan and so forth. So it becomes ever more important to invest in this. And then secondly, as I said earlier, job creation is probably the central challenge in addition to institution building in the region. So we have quite a host of programs, both bilateral and regional, that try to address job creation and make it easier to create SMEs through various measures, from training, from empowering students that would like to become jeunes promoteurs, creating startups and so forth, to making access to finance for micro enterprises or small-scale enterprises easier. There are a couple of big initiatives. For example, there is a program for SMEs that we are implementing together with KfW that mobilizes altogether from various donors 320 million euros for this purpose. There are new programs that we are launching in this respect. There are, of course, the activities of the Neighbourhood Investment Facilitate, which has so far generated, if you look at the leverage effect, up to 8 billion euros, not only for infrastructure projects, but very often also for projects that have an accent on job creation and the creation of enterprises and small-scale businesses. So I think this has become one of the most prominent features of our activities. The only thing that we still need to do is to give it more visibility. We're doing lots of things. We have been doing lots of things. We're investing more in this kind of project. But I think we need to also represent this and present this in a consolidated way so that our partners in the Arab countries, on the Arab street, so to say, understand that Europe stands by their side in creating job opportunities for these huge numbers of young people that are looking for jobs and that have to look for jobs in the private sector, because the public sector cannot take them in as it has been the case in the past.
And what is the role of the SMEs in this context for the Southern Shore?
Well, the role of SMEs is huge for two reasons. First, we all know, and Europe is the best example, that SMEs are the best places for job creation. Jobs are more created in SMEs rather than in the big companies. And secondly, if you look at the structure of companies in the Arab countries, you see that 90% of the economy is SMEs. There are very few big companies, and even these big companies get smaller because, I mean, as we are going into an area of privatization and of more competition, for example, the old state-held monopolies very often break up. SMEs are covering the new sectors. SMEs have a dynamic element. And as I said, the challenge of job creation is that big that there's no chance for the countries in the region to continue with the old policy of basically putting people into the public sector, like in Egypt in the old days, where every university diploma holder, had a guarantee to be employed by the state. No, today these people have to find their role in the private sector. And if the private sector cannot absorb them, we need to improve possibilities to create new businesses, startups and so forth. Now this is easier said than done, but I think this is, in terms of economic policy, the only way we can go. And therefore we are channeling lots of funds into this, but it requires more than just finance. It requires a change in culture, it requires an enabling environment, and therefore we are working very hard with our partner governments also on the overall policy environment to change legislation, to change the way how the financing sector is acting, to create a business environment more conducive for SMEs. I think that is the central challenge. Not only in the Arab countries, also in many European member states.